Do you want to introduce you guys first?
Did you want it?
Yeah, that sounds good. All right, so Mike, just so you know, the format I guess we're looking at, I think you guys are presenting points. We're going to present a point, you present a point, present a point, you present a point, and we'll do a rebuttal at the end. Does that sound good?
Sounds fine with me. We're having a lot of tests today, so I'll have two students. We'll manage.
All right.
Okay, so you want to start with your first point, and we'll.
Hello guys, we're David Suzuki, a school in Ontario, Canada, and this is a hospitality class here at our school, and we're going to start our debate on GMO versus non-GMO foods. Yeah, take it away guys.
We're from Delaware High School. This is our debate class. I'm Emma, and this is Aaliyah, and to discuss the pros of GMOs.
You want to do the first one?
Are we still?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Tell me what it is.
We're here to discuss whether the GMOs are dangerous to the economy, the human health, and the environment. The arguments I will be tackling are the claims from opponents of these products. The claim that the GMOs are carcinogenic, close-fate, the claim that GMOs promote monopoly, and the claim that GMOs are bad because Monsanto made place your favorite scary chemical here. According to the National Pesticide Information Center, since its registration in 1976, the herbicide known as glyphosate is currently in over 750 different products available to the United States, meaning that it is not restricted to GMOs. And to address the term carcinogenic is simply a word meaning that whatever is dubbed this could cause cancer. The label possibly carcinogenic was given to GMO. In March of 2015, an article done by the Washington Post points out that the agency that bestowed this label does not do its own research. The article then went on to explain that the Environmental Protection Agency assessment of the chemical was in fact very different, stating that it reviewed over 55 epidemiological studies conducted by the possible cancer and non-cancer effects of glyphosate and concluded that this body of research does not provide evidence to show that glyphosate causes cancer. This is the same conclusion reached by the 2004 by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Observation Organization and affirmed this year by Germany's pesticide regulatory officials. This is strictly evidentiary towards my point. Going to monopolies. When I first heard this argument, I thought about the board game, but apparently some GMO opponents are convinced that GMOs are the sole cause of monopolies. The problems with monopolies is a tough one, and I don't know what the solution might be since it takes a long time for the GE product to go through the regulatory process and with how difficult it is for small companies to last very long. During the time, employees need to be paid, logistics need to be taken care of, and the product pipeline needs to continue its development while no revenue is being generated. However, by no means is this a problem unique to the agricultural biotech center. The small tech companies are gobbled up by larger behemoths every day. In October of 2017, The Nation states that monopolies are a huge problem in America, citing the fact that the 5 American firms, Apple, Microsoft, Google, Cisco, and Oracle, collectively have more than $500 billion stashed abroad as they achieve tax rates, in some cases, well under 1% of their profits. This is obviously a huge problem and has little to do with GMOs. In fact, makes it very clear that the oversimplification of the issue of monopolies to just GMOs is not only misguided and wrong, but is far from being the only problem or a problem about GMOs. But it also does not do credit to the good that GMOs can do. Moving on to the arguments concerning Monsanto. Monsanto has a checker pass, as they were one of the companies involved in Agent Orange, something that hurt people. Agent Orange was used to deprive guerrillas on the ground of food and coverage during the Vietnam War. The U.S. government placed orders from the companies for Agent Orange, Monsanto being one of them. Although there were multiple people to blame, primarily the U.S. government, the Monsanto was exclusively blamed blamed for Agent Orange. I think we can all agree that this is not something that should have occurred. Despite the stain on their reputation, however, Monsanto is not an evil company. In fact, it raised the farmers' average bushels of corn per acre of 905.5 in 1979 to 160 in 2013. They developed something that saves millions of lives. In 2012, the World Health Organization reported that 250 million preschool children are affected by VAD, and that providing those children with golden rice, a strain of rice injected with vitamin A, could prevent a third of under 5 deaths, which amounts to 2.7 million that could be saved from dying unnecessarily. This is just some of the good Monsanto has done, and they continue to do more good through the use of GMOs. This is only 3 of the arguments that GMOs have been against GMOs that have been disproven by minutes of real research. The claim that GMOs are a danger to life as we know it is simply too flimsy to withstand when brought against facts. That is very telling. Okay. The GMOs have raised concern about the supposed health maladies that have supposedly occurred due to them, but these are false allegations that need to be put to rest. GMOs are not toxic. The GMOs help malnutrition, and the biotech can make food healthier, giving lettuce a greater concentration of nutrients, reducing starch in potatoes, and lowering saturated fat content in cooking oils. Studies suggest genes introduced the GMO tomatoes can introduce their natural production of antitoxins that might help prevent cancer and heart disease. Improving the nutritional values of foods can be particularly significant in boosting diets for developing countries. Any concerns about the actual methods of genetically modified are highly unwarranted. Any plant or animal product is full of DNA that our body readily digests. Messing with 1 or 2 genes isn't going to impact human health. The only way GMO food could affect human health is if they somehow modify to produce a product protein that is effectively toxic to humans. Moving on to the economic.
Hi. Well, if you're done your argument now,
Yes.
if you're finished your first argument, we'd like to move on to our first argument as well, and we'll start with the environmental argument.
Is that what they're doing?
What argument were you guys just doing? Human health?
Yes.
Yes.
So if you were just starting with your human health argument, we will start with our health argument as well. So.
So GMOs are used to make food look perfect and have perfect nutrition, but this modification affects humans, since every food is different and natural food is better, since humans were originally introduced to natural foods. GMOs may seem like a good idea for mass production and with less defects in food, but it doesn't mean it makes it better for us humans to intake unnatural foods. GMOs attack the human health. It affects some more seriously than others, such as allergies and reproduction problems. So you guys. Okay.
So our first argument is allergies. People may develop many allergies to GMOs or even already have allergies to their food due to it being modified and chemicals being on it. However, because we have had genetically modified food for so long, some people even develop allergies to food that isn't genetically modified. Due to there being so many years of food being modified, there will always be modification being made that may make people sick of the foods that they weren't allergic to before. When foods are constantly being modified, the effects of it are also constantly changing with our diet and lifestyles. Allergies may result in death, diseases, and illness that may lead to death. People will become allergic due to genes from other organisms being put in their foods, such as soy, peanuts, etc. The effects on humans of consuming these new combination of proteins produced in GMOs are unknown, but they have been linked to toxic and allergic reactions, sick, steroids, and death livestock, and damage to virtually every organ studied in lab animals.
Okay, so the second argument is reproductive problems. According to the researchers, genetically modified foods are becoming a real problem when it comes to fertility. In the 1970s alone, sperm counts among the world's male population have declined as much as 40 to 50% according to some studies. Studies show that genetically modified food can cause reproductive problems and infertility. The foods of the experiments that were held to prove the effects of genetically modified foods on our reproductive systems are more than half the babies of mother rats fed genetically modified soy died within 3 weeks. The DNA of mouse embryos function differently when their parents were fed genetically modified soy. Babies of female rats fed genetically modified soy were considerably smaller, and more than half died within 3 weeks compared to 10% of the non-genetically modified soy controls. Female rats fed genetically modified soy showed changes in their ovaries and uteruses, and by the third generation, most hamsters fed the genetically modified soy were unable to have babies.
Newborns and pregnant mothers' diet can affect children and be passed on to future generations. GMOs are more risky for children than adults. Children are generally more susceptible to toxins, allergens, and nutritional problems. Their milk consumption may be from RBGH treated cows. The emergence of antibiotic resistant, therefore, children are prone to recurrent infections.
That's all.
Okay, did you want us to rebut each point, but do you want us to go to the next point, rebut it at the very end? How do you want to do it?
We're going to have a rebuttal period at the very end, so you may now proceed to your next points.
Okay. Moving on to the economic and environmental effects of GMOs. Okay. According to the meta-analysis done over 140 studies by a member of the Department of Agricultural Economics and Rural Development in the tail end of 2014, the price has increased an average of 22%. This is substantially better than the yield of non-GMO farming, which has been found to be 34% lower than by a combined study done by a member of the Department of Geography and Global Economic, Environmental, and Climate Change Center, and a member of the Institute of the Environment. This increased yield is nothing to scoff at, it is much needed. The United Nations Department of Economic and Social Affairs projects that by 2050, the world population will grow to be at least 9.7 billion, increasing by 173% in the next 30 years. GMOs are needed to feed the growing population around us. According to the estimation done by the United Nations Food and Agricultural Organization in 2016, 815 million people are suffering from starvation and undernourishment. GMOs are needed and will continue to be needed if we expect that 815 million to increase by 173%, which is imminent. Moving on. Humans have been modifying crops for over tens of thousands of years, yet we're here to discuss them and whether their impact is more beneficial to everything. We've been using them for years. Recently, the GMOs have raised concerns all over the world, and today we would like to ease some of these concerns. There has been chatter that GMOs have negative effects on the environment, but this can be put to rest as we will assure you that this could not be more false for the following reasons. The GMO crops reduce air pollution, are beneficial to insects, and they are not a new thing. Less tilling is thanks to genetically modified herbicide-tolerant crops. Also means that farmers spend less time on their tractors, using less fuel and reducing carbon emissions. Conservation tillage enabled by genetic modified crops has reduced greenhouse gas emissions on farms globally and can help farmers adapt to mitigate climate change. The fact is that in 2015, 58.9 billion pounds of atmospheric carbon dioxide emissions were reduced by conservation of tillage and decreased fuel used by made possible by genetically modified crops. That's equal to removing nearly 12 million cars from roads for 1 year. Studies showed that the introduction of GMO soybean and corn in the United States led to 13 million kilo reduction in pesticide use in 12 years up to 2009. By reducing the need to spray, the GMOs also cut farmers' fuel emissions, helping fight global warming. Moving further, for a long time, there have been increased interest in whether the genetically modified crops have a harsher impact on the environment. There is also interest in any effects that might be associated with recombinant and novel combinations of DNA passing through the environment and the possibility that they may be taken up by microorganisms or other live biological material. Utilizing the knowledge of 2002 findings of sources such as Kessler C and Economical, EC-sponsored research from the Safety and Genetically Modified Organizations, and James C.A. Global Renewed Review of Commercial Transgenic Crops of 2011, no compelling scientific arguments have been found that can demonstrate that GM crops are horrible for the environment, as some may claim. The general misconception is that there is a staggering difference is highly exaggerated to the point that it's not at all true. Thus, the GMOs are not a threat to the habitat that they reside in. In fact, the attribute of GMOs is that they use Bt proteins to make insect resistant. These proteins will only affect a specific group of pests and has little to no effect on any other insects. This is hopefully beneficial to the insects that would previously be killed due to commonly broad-spectrum insecticides being sprayed. And finally, we've been modifying beehives since Egyptian days. Corn was not as plentiful before we got to it, and the watermelons were vastly different. That's not even mentioning the banana, which is not what you think it is. The real banana, it was gone years ago. There are no real bananas, but they're still good for you. To conclude, genetically modified crops have been used commercially for more than 18 years now. The available impact studies of insect-resistant and herbicide-tolerant crops show that these technologies are beneficial to farmers, consumers, producing large aggregate welfare gains as well as positive effects for the environment and human health. To be against GMOs is to be for the extermination of bees, the increase of bugs, and the protection of bad air.
Thank you very much, and now we'll start with our environmental argument. Sorry.
The world has evolved into a very ecocentric society, in contrast to our hunter-gatherer communities, where it was more of a community where people cared about not only themselves, but how other people were doing. People have become more self-centered by means of only investing and caring about things that will benefit themselves and their families. So considering the environmental effects that our decisions have has become a foreign concept to many. And genetically modified foods are an example of that, where people are only thinking about the present day and how we can get food on the table very fast. The environment is directly impacted by genetically modified organisms, as the environment is the basis of the food chain. So our following argument will talk about how the environment affects GMOs, how GMOs are affected by the environment.
Roundup, a herbicide that contains high rates of glyphosate chemicals, are used and sprayed on GMOs, and when the more spraying of glyphosate, the higher amounts that end up in groundwater, surface water, soil. Researchers of Mexican water sources found traces of glyphosate in wells along riverbanks, providing diversity of water. Glyphosate application in close proximity to rivers is problematic to wildlife populations. A high amount is lethal to amphibians and other organisms. 3 weeks of using Roundup killed 96 to 100% of larval amphibians in their natural environment.
Okay, so I'm going to talk about how the GMOs and pesticides being sprayed on GMOs specifically are affecting the environment. An example of honeybees. With the honeybees being the most important food pollinators, scientists scrambled to identify the killer. The attention turns to the increased use of pesticide known as I can't even pronounce it. The companies like Monsanto's, Bayer, and etc. use pesticide and herbicides. We need honeybees as they are the critical to the food production. The American Honey Beekeeping Federation said 90% of plants are dependent on bees for pollination.
Okay, so another point that we have, a study has found that plant-based protein powders contain the most pesticides, even more than animal-based protein powders. Thus, the effects of pesticides and GMOs on the environment is evident, as plants internalize most of the chemicals that GMOs contain, and in turn are not only affecting the environment, but also human health. So in conclusion, we do urge you to not only think about how GMOs are affecting the present day, but how they affect our environment now, which will carry on the future.
Thank you. And to just confirm, you were doing your environmental and economical argument previously? Yes. Okay, so now we are going to move on to our economical argument.
Go ahead.
Well, as I'm sure the majority of us understand what a GMO is, and we all have our own present views whether it is good or bad, today we are here to argue that GMOs are bad for our economics. So genetically modified organisms are bad for our economics because GMOs bring numerous things to our economy that we don't like. Things like soil erosion, health effects, job problems, decrease in farms, and the decrease in the quality of life.
India, a country with 1.4 billion people, one of the fastest growing, is still farming because of GMO. 600 million farmers will turn to 20 million farmers, which would mean 580 million Indians looking for work. Which means what industry would be creating 580 million jobs these days?
Inefficiency built into the GMO food model. Only 2% of GMO soy is actually eaten. In addition, most of the corn in the U.S. is actually not even edible. And 10% of corn ends up being used directly in foods. Most GMO corn is either processed into gums, pastes, additives, fillers, ethanol, or other products. According to Dr. Shiva, 80% of our actual food comes from small farms, whereas only 20% comes from these monocrops that are claimed to be the answer to global hunger. That 20% goes to factory farms as animal feed.
Okay, so I'm going to be talking about enforcing patents and the economic changes. So for those who don't know, a patent is a set of exclusive rights granted by a sovereign state or in-governmental organization to an inventor or assignee for a limited period of time in exchange for detailed public disclosure of an invention. So basically, trying to enforce a patent can be very challenging because some of the farmers who have grown GM products from companies such as Monsanto have cited that they did not do so by choice. Instead, they claim that their GM products are a result of cross-pollination. Biotechnology companies can insert a suicide gene into the modified plant, then the plant can only be sustained for one growing season, and there would be the production of seeds that are unable to germinate. The end result is that farmers would be forced to purchase new seeds every year. Yet, if you consider the economic challenges of third world countries and developing nations, this would be an economic disaster. They would be unable to afford seeds every year. In contrast, most farmers would usually put a portion of their harvest aside each year to plant in the following year. So, the next topic is using patents for profits. Due to the enormous cost and time investment in developing successful GM products, patents exist to protect the rights of companies. There are many genetic engineering techniques in GM products that have been patented. In the biotechnology field, patent infringement is a huge and controversial issue. Unfortunately, there are economic concerns around the use of patents. Consumer groups worry that by placing a patent on a new kind of GM plant, the price of the seeds can be raised to such an extent that small-scale farm operations and farmers in developing countries will not be able to afford these GM varieties of crops. In this way, the divide between wealthy and poor nations will be increased quite significantly. Some people have the hope that costs can be lowered when companies are seek to sell GM needs to developing and third world countries. To move on to my next point, that ties into perfectly that how GMOs, as you guys said before, yields in to stop the world hunger. Whereas sustainable non-GMO agriculture methods has been used in developing countries have consecutively resulted in yield increases of 79% and higher. GMOs do not average increased yields at all. This was evident in the Union of Concerned Scientists in 2009 that reported a failure of yield, the definitive study to date on GM crops and yield. The International Assessment of Agricultural Knowledge, Science and Technology for Development report, authored by more than 400 scientists and backed by 58 governments, stated that GM crops yields were highly variable and in some cases yields declined. The report noted assessment of the technology lags between its development. If information is anecdotal and contradictory, and uncertainty about possible benefits and damage is unavoidable. They determined that the current GMOs have nothing to offer the goals of reducing hunger and poverty, improving nutrition, health, and rural livelihoods, and facilitating social and environmental sustainability. On the contrary, GMOs divert money and resources that would otherwise be spent on more safe, reliable, and appropriate technologies. Oh, not done yet.
GMOs decrease herbicides use. Most GMO crops are engineered to be herbicide tolerant. They defy deadly weed killers. They defy deadly weed killers. Monsanto, for example, sells Roundup-ready crops designed to survive applications for the Roundup herbicides. Between 1996 and 2008, U.S. farmers sprayed an extra 383 million pounds of herbicide on GMOs. Overuse of Roundup results in superweeds resistant to the herbicide. This is causing farmers to use even more toxic herbicides every year. Not only does this create environmental harm, GM foods contain high residues of toxic herbicides. Roundup, for example, is linked with hormone distribution, birth defects, and cancer.
Thank you. That was our economical and environmental arguments. So now if you would like to move on to your last argument, you can proceed with that.
Thank you. Go ahead. What? Industrial farming.
In the mid-1980s, Belgian researchers found a better way to produce their insecticide. They put a gene from the bacteria into tobacco plants, and when bugs tried to eat the plants, they died. Now, farmers wouldn't need the bacteria, but the plants that had the new gene, known as Bt, could produce the insecticide protein on their own. Environmentalists flipped. What upset them wasn't the insecticide, but the genetic engineering. Thus began the strange backlash against Bt crops. The protein that everyone had previously agreed was innocuous suddenly became a menace. To many critics of biotechnology, the long history of safe Bt use was irrelevant. What mattered was that Bt was now a GMO, and GMOs were evil. In 1995, the EPA approved Bt potatoes, corn, and cotton. The agency noted that the toxin produced by these crops was identical to the produced naturally by bacterium and affects insects when ingested, but not mammals. But opponents weren't mollified. In 1999, a coalition led by Greenpeace and the Center for Food Safety, the Pesticide Action Network, and the International Federation of Organic Agricultural Movements sued by EPA to revoke its approvals. The suit was Bt crops might create insecticide-resistant insects and cause direct harm to non-target organisms. The coalition claimed to speak for environmental caution, but its caution was curiously selective. 30 of the 34 farmers who are identified in the lawsuit as victims and plaintiffs affirmed that they sprayed Bt on their own crops. 14 of the 16 farming organizations listed as plaintiffs said that they had members who used Bt spray. One plaintiff, according to the lawsuit, was a supplier of organic fertilizer and pest controls, whose business consists of selling foliar Bt products to conventional apple growers. Another one was one of the largest suppliers of beneficial insects and natural organisms designed to control agricultural pests, including several Bt products. Greenpeace and its partners weren't fighting the Bt industries. They were protecting it. They were trying to convince the public that Bt protein was dangerous when produced by plants, but perfectly safe when produced by bacteria and sprayed by farmers. The anti-GMO lobby says that Bt are worse than Bt sprays, in part because Bt crops have too much of the bacterial toxin. In 2007, for instance, Greenpeace promoted a court petition to stop field trials of Bt eggplant in India. The petition told the country's highest court the Bt toxin in GM crops is 100 times more concentrated than in Bt sprays. But Greenpeace internal research bellied that statement. In 2002, Greenpeace report based on the Chinese lab test found that the toxin level in Bt crops was severely limited. In 2006, the Greenpeace investigators examined the Bt corn in Germany and Spain, and they got a surprise. The plants sampled showed in general very low Bt concentrations. The honest environmental organization, having discovered these low concentrations, might have reconsidered its opposition to Bt crops, but Greenpeace simply changed its rationale. Having argued that the 1999 lawsuit that Bt crops produced too much toxin, Greenpeace now reverts so. In its report on German and Spanish corn, the organization complained that Bt crops produced too little toxin to be effective. It argued, in presence, that Bt was a transgenic crop that was unsafe for humans, but insignificant to kill bugs. The anti-GMO activists also claim that the insecticidal protein is activated in Bt crops, but not in Bt sprays, and that this makes Bt crops more dangerous to people. That's misleading. Activation means that the protein is truncated, which helps to bind the guts of insects, and each Bt plant is different. A global database of GE crops maintained by the Center of Environmental Risk Assessment shows that some Bt proteins are fully while others are partially truncated, and the fully truncated proteins are just semi-activated, according to the technical assessment that was sent to Greenpeace by its own consultants 15 years ago. Unless you're a bug, Bt is inactive. Again, to its 1999 lawsuit, the Greenpeace said that Bt crops were dangerous because their toxins were not readily degraded by the environment. The organization and its allies have repeated this allegation many times since, but when it was convenient, Greenpeace says the opposite. In 2006, the petition to block Bt crops in New Zealand speculated that the concentration of toxin in Bt cotton might be too low because the Bt protein is degraded and linked to heat stress. The petition added that the plant's defense mechanisms may also reduce the insecticidal activity of Bt. In fact, in 2006, petitions suggested that the low concentration of Bt in Indian cotton was allowing insects to flourish, leading to crop loss and causing farmers to fall into debt and kill themselves. The suicide allegation was just another anti-GMO fiction, but it allowed Greenpeace to claim that the Bt is a transgenic crop was killing people in two ways, by being more persistent and potent than the Bt in sprays and being less persistent and potent in the Bt sprays. The strange part of the case is that the Bt crops and the cumulative evidence of harm. Numerous studies have found that Bt is one of the world's safest pesticides. Still, if you run enough experience on any pesticide, the few will produce correlations that look worrisome. But that's just the first step in challenging a scientific consensus. Experts then debate whether the correlations are causal and whether the effects are important. They ask for better controlled experiments to validate the pattern. That's where the case of Bt crops and other GMOs have repeatedly failed. And that isn't what's strange. What's strange is that so much of the ostensible evidence against Bt crops is at best evidence against Bt sprays. In its 2006 petition, the regulators in New Zealand Greenpeace argued that Bt crops, by applying evolutionary pressure, would generate Bt-resistant insects, thereby depriving organic farmers of their rightful use of Bt as a pesticide. The petition also warned that the Bt toxin could persist in soils for over 200 days, and that this could cause problems for non-target organisms and their health of the soil ecosystem. But 2 of the 3 experiments cited as evidence for the soil warning weren't done with Bt crops. They were done with dipel, a commercial Bt spray compound. Greenpeace was asking New Zealand to protect Bt spray from Bt crops based on studies that, if used, indicated Bt spray. The 2007 petition against Bt eggplant in India repeated this fallacy. The natural bacterium Bt is very important in advanced organic agriculture, said the petition, for the reason it argued the evolution of Bt-resistant insects due to Bt crops would be a serious threat to many types of agriculture on which this country, such as India, inevitably and rightly relies. But an addendum to the petition cited as evidence of the Bt peril studies were done by Javelin, Beret, and Vectovac, 3 Bt spray compounds. The paradox pervades that the anti-GMO movement. Alarmism about any possibility of harm from Bt crops coupled with the relentless flaking of the Bt spray industry. Farmers have always used Bt sparingly and usually as a last resort, says the Organic Consumers Organization. But that doesn't spare the product literature for commercial Bt sprays. One brochure recommends motorized boom sprayers and says aerial applications are also commonplace in many crops. Another explains that many avocado orchards are sprayed by helicopter. Saturation is a point of emphasis. Sprays should thoroughly cover all plant surfaces, even the undersides of leaves. Greenpeace says you needn't worry because Bt proteins from natural Bt sprays degrade within 2 weeks. But this is a false assurance. Many farmers compensate for the degradation by reapplying the spray. A typical brochure recommends reapplication every 5 to 7 days. That's plenty of time to get the toxin to your mouth, since the product literature tells the growers that ripe fruit can be picked and eaten the same day that it is sprayed. In YouTube videos, organic farmers delivered the same instructions. You should spray your vegetables with Bt every 4 days, coating each surface, and you can eat the food right after you spray it. Bt, unlike Bt crops, include live bacteria which can multiply in food. Several years ago, researchers examined vegetables in the sale in Denmark. They found 23 stands of Bt identical to the kind used in commercial sprays. In China, a similar study of milk, ice cream, and green tea beverages found in 19 Bt strands, 5 of them identical to the kind used in sprays. In Canada, nasal swabs of people living outside and inside zones where Bt was being applied found the bacteria in 17% of samples taken for the crops to spray, and as well as 36% to 47% of samples taken afterwards. Nobody monitors how much Bt is applied worldwide. Last fall, the Wall Street Journal estimated that annual sales of biopesticides were roughly $2 billion. Bt has been said to account for 57 to 90% of the market. In 2001, Bt was reportedly applied in the U.S. in more than 40% of tomatoes and 60% of brassica crops, which include broccoli, cauliflower, and cabbage. Since then, biopesticide sales have risen substantially. In Europe, the annual growth since 2000 has been nearly 17%. Every market analysis predicts that biopesticides will grow at a much faster rate than overall pesticide market, in part being GMOs are promoting them. The Journal projects that in 2020, 10% of global pesticide sales will be Bt and other biological formulas. One result of this paradox, the GMOs under attack while
excuse me, Texas, can you hear me? Okay. We don't have a lot of time left, and we still have one group that would like to present. So can we just do a quick summary on that argument that you're doing, and then I'll ask you to present, and then maybe we can get a debate?
Go ahead and just begin.
All right.
Oh.
So we believe that GMOs within industrial farming is unethical. It will lead to more serious problems in the future. If it is not dealt with correctly, it becomes unhealthy when used numerous times. GMO plants such as corn, soybeans, and etc. have had foreign genes forced into their DNA. The inserted genes come from species such as bacteria and viruses, which have never been in the human food supply. We are in a mass producing dangerous food to the population through antibiotics that they inject into their animals, which can create the animals to become ill. It can be transmitted to the consumers from the meat that they eat, causing illnesses that can be easily treated with antibiotics. Primary GMO foods contain glyphosate, which is a bacteria, and it is used to kill both plants and grasses. It can create cancer and other diseases and side effects to the body. Overall, GMOs affected individuals' health and the farmers' economic issues, which is why we are not for GMOs.
Okay, so basically, GMO crops have been commercially grown since 1995, and the GMO production has been growing from 1.7 million acres in 1996 to 182 million acres in 2014. And 10 countries are responsible for 98% of this GMO acres worldwide, including the US and Canada. The US being responsible for 73.1 million acres, and Canada being responsible for 11.6 million acres. But there are many countries that are against GMO production, including the European Union, so pretty much all of Europe. Also, many African countries are against it as well for several reasons, including the public view, political decisions, and it's also negative views from the citizens and the farmers as well. So basically that's what we wanted to focus on, was the farming part of the agricultural part of this argument. So also a country that's also against it as well is Switzerland. And this all comes from the reason of cross-pollination. Because of the acres being so worldwide and producing so much, it's hard to keep track of all genetically modified crops. So the mixing of genetically modified crops and non-genetically modified crops becomes an issue. So and the unintended presence of genetically modified crops in food and free trade channels can cause serious trade and economic issues. So as an example, with a company called Liberty Link Rice, a GMO crop rice produced by Bayer Crop Sciences, traces of this were found commercially in food streams, and therefore before they were able to be deregulated for production in the US. And when this happens, it causes there's a huge economic impact, which causes the US rice farmers to halt their exports, and it results in hundreds of millions of dollars in financial loss.
So for what I'm going to talk about is, at our more to the point, is where people, when they eat the meat, they can cause illnesses, or they can get illnesses as like digestive orders, damaged organs, or infertility, weak immune systems. So how that would all come from is when the animals are crammed into contained, filthy environments, and they're force-fed monocultural diets of genetically modified corn and soy. So for example, all those meats you eat, like the calves, they're going to be born too weak to walk. They're going to have enlarged joints and limbs, deformities. The piglets, will experience rapidly distorting health. They'll have failure to thrive, so their severe start breaking down, and they'll start eating their own tissues and organs, which is we call self-cannibalizing, to survive. And many animals suffer from this when they're in those conditions. And when it comes for the dairy cows, they develop metastasis and painful udder infections, and the beef can develop the abscesses and excruciating conditions referred to as twisted guts.
Thank you. Those are our arguments, and now we would like to move into the quick rebuttal period. So if you guys would like to start with your rebuttals.
Yeah. Earlier at the beginning of your arguments, you stated that natural food is better than GMO food, but according to certain statistics, and what we have learned from this is that it makes no sense to avoid the GMO based on standards that nobody applies to non-GMO foods. Yes, it is convincible that you can overdose on vitamin A or ingest a viral protein from eating fruits, grains, or vegetables, but GMOs do not make any of those scenarios more likely or more dangerous. In fact, if you look at illnesses or direct, or correlation between the food sales or disease trends, which anti-GMO advices like to do, you can make a better case against organic food than GMO. You also stated that the reproduction problems and allergies are caused by GMOs, but you also stated that there's no link to connect GMOs and these certain diseases. So that basically takes out your argument because you just countered it yourself. You also use some logical fallacies like cause and effect, which takes out your argument because you are providing false causes. You also use the words may, could, probably, and multiple times in your argument, which makes your argument weaker, and it takes it out in the way. Yeah. You talked about rice, but you didn't bring up the golden rice, a strain of GMOs that have saved millions of lives. You're saying that because they're putting GMOs in rice that it's killing people, but according to the golden rice statistics that it's been saving lives. GMOs produce more food, which provide more food for people and helps them. Anything further? I think we're good here.
Okay. Go ahead, Yuri.
We're gonna rebuttal your point there with the rice and the fallacies. Okay.
Okay, so in your rebuttal, you guys said that you said natural food is worse than GMO. So for this, I have something to say. The American Academy of Environmental Medicine urges doctors to prescribe non-GMO diets for all patients. They cite studies showing organ damage, gastrointestinal and immune system disorders, accelerated aging, and infertility. Human studies show genetically modified food can leave behind material inside us, which can cause long-term bacteria problems, right? And including autism, mental disorders. Numerous health problems have increased after GMOs were introduced in 1996. The percentage of Americans with 3 or more chronic illnesses jumped from 17% to 13% in just 9 years. Food allergies skyrocketed, and disorders such as autism, reproductive disorders, digestive problems, and others are on the rise. Although there is not sufficient research to confirm that GMOs are a contributing factor, doctors groups such as tell us to wait before we start protecting ourselves and our children are most at risk. Also, the American Public Health Association and American nurses, among many medical groups, condemn that the use of GM bovine growth hormone because of the milk from treated cows has more of the hormone IGF-1 insulin-like growth factor, which, if you wanted to know, which is linked to cancer. So basically what I was saying, you guys said that natural and GMO is better. Well, you can say that can feed a population, but it also at the same time can kill it just as much as it saves.
To address these concerns about how GMOs are better and safe for the human body, there have been 100 scientific research studies comparing the effects of traditional food to genetically modified food, which results have been reviewed by various journals. How these results affect regulation can be found throughout the Center of Environmental Risk Assessment, which hosts a GM crop database that can be searched by public to find GMO crop history, style modification, and regulation across the world. Though knowing who to trust and who to believe regards this topic and knowing the major health groups, the American Medical Association and the World Health Organization have concluded that the research from independent groups worldwide, the genetically modified food is safe for consumers, safer than organic. Thank you.
We're running out of time. We're running out of time here, so if anyone wants to say a quick rebuttal back, we're coming to a conclusion of this debate.
One second. Mr. Cunningham?
You guys going to lunch?
I'm sorry, Mr. Cunningham, we did not understand what you just said.
Do you go to lunch?
Mr. Cunningham, is it possible for us to, Mr. Wilson here, he's behind me, I'm not sure if you can see him. He's hoping that maybe we can revisit this a little bit later. I don't know if your two students there are able to come back or some more. Unfortunately, we're on a rotary schedule, so the students here are off to.
Okay. Well,
there's another class coming in here.
I hope they enjoy their GMO lunch.
You guys enjoy the conversation?
I think we need to revisit this.
Okay. Sounds good.
You guys have a final statement? Anyone?
Clayton, just tell me when and we'll schedule it.
Okay, that sounds excellent. They're just going to say bye.
Bye. Bye. Thank you.
Good work, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, guys.